Jennifer and Josephine by Peet. Jennifer was already an old automobile way back in the year of 1933. The old touring car had traveled over 100,000 miles and been sold or traded so many times she couldn't remember all the owners. Now at last she was worn out and sold for scrap iron and left sitting in the far corner of an auto junkyard, just passing the time, rusting away. Still, Jennifer wasn't altogether unhappy. At least she had a friend, a scrawny stray cat named Josephine. Josephine had raised a litter of kittens in the back seat of the old car. When the kittens were grown up enough to look out for themselves, one by one they had wandered away, while the mother cat stayed. Josephine had become attached to the car, for it was the only home she'd ever known. The cat left her rickety old home on wheels just long enough to search for food. She wandered the neighborhood alleys, stopping at kitchen doors where there was a chance a few scraps and leftovers. Then she hurried home, afraid she might find her old car in pieces. That was what happened to all the other old cars in the junkyard. They were sold for parts, so it was only a matter of time. One morning, Josephine was awakened by the sound of voices. They were very close by, and the curious cat sat up for a look. It was the junkyard man, and a large, long-legged fellow with 2 suitcases, and puffing a cigar. "I buy 'em cheap and run the reels off 'em," growled the big old fellow. "Will she run?" "You can give her a try," said the junkyard man. "They build 'em to last in those old days." The fellow sat down heavily behind the steering wheel, then jammed a big foot on the starter. There was a row, 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 then a sputter, sput, sput, ending with a cough. "Try her again," said the junkyard man. "She'll run." Once more the big foot jammed on the starter, and once more there was a row, 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 and a sputter, sput, sput. Suddenly the old car's motor came to life with a mighty roar. Josephine was so startled she leaped out of the back seat and over the fence. It was a big surprise to Jennifer, too. She never dreamed that her rusty old motor would ever run again. "If you take her," said the junkyard man, "I'll throw in a set of good used tires at the very same price." "It's a deal," growled the big fellow. "If you can change them in a hurry, I've got places to go." In a half an hour, Jennifer went tottering across the junkyard on a good set of used tires. As the old car reached the gate and was about to head out into the street, Josephine decided she was going too, and she shot across the junkyard like a streak, leaped into the rear fender, and quietly into the back seat. It had been years since Jennifer had driven down a city street, and she was alarmed at all the way things had changed. Now there was 10 times as much traffic, and it was one great turmoil of taxis, trucks, and autos, rudely crowding their way past streetcars and buses with noisy mobs of people swarming in between. Jennifer's driver was just as pushy and rude as the rest, and he bullied his way right through the midst of the jam and across the city. Josephine had an uneasy feeling that there might be trouble ahead. When they had passed the city limits and were headed out onto the country, the man turned on the speed. In a few miles, the old car was racing along at 50, then 55, and pretty soon 60. Jennifer was horrified. They were going much too fast for the twisting, hilly roads full of ruts and chuckholes. The poor cat was scared, for this was her first automobile ride. The fastest she's ever traveled was on her own 4 feet, and both the car and the cat were relieved when at last they pulled into a small town. The frantic fellow brought the car to a jolting stop at the main street, jerked his suitcases off the seat, and went charging into a hardware store. Josephine guessed he must be a traveling salesman, and since she didn't know the name of him, she thought of him as Mr. Frenzy. In a few minutes, Mr. Frenzy came bustling out of the store, and in 3 long steps and a jump, he was back in the car, and away they went. As they left the small town and were just beginning to pick up speed, they were caught behind a huge trailer truck with a heavy load creeping up a steep hill at 2 miles an hour. Mr. Frenzy was furious. Suddenly, they went charging past the truck on the wrong side of the road. Josephine couldn't believe that anyone could be so foolhardy as to pass on a hill. Even a cat knew better than that. If something happened to be coming on the other side of the hill, there could be a catastrophe. And sure enough, something was coming. It was another huge truck charging straight at them. There was no place for them to go but off the road, and with one desperate jerk on the steering wheel, Mr. Frenzy set Jennifer crashing through a rail fence, and then she went careening across the field, out of control. The old car ripped through a haystack, sideswiped a henhouse, plowed through a pumpkin patch, uprooted a scarecrow, crashed through another fence, and then bounced back onto the road with a bam as her right wheel tire blew out. Mr. Frenzy was out of the car in one leap, jacked up the rear wheels, ripped off the tattered tire, and jammed on the spare. Then frantically he worked at the air pump, expecting a furious farmer to come charging out of the farmhouse at any second. But the only one there was a fiercely barking collie in the front yard. The farmer and his family had gone to the county fair, so Mr. Frenzy was lucky. In a few minutes he drove off as if nothing had happened. Josephine thought that surely the fellow would slow down after such a close call with a truck. However, she was mistaken. Pretty soon they were racing a fast freight train, and on ahead the road took a sharp turn over the railroad crossing. The engineer warned the car to stop with a shrieking blast on its whistle. But there was no stopping Mr. Frenzy. He was in too big a hurry to wait for a long freight train to pass, and he kept the old car racing ahead at top speed. As they swerved wildly around the turn towards the crossing, the terrified cat went nearly thrown out. She barely managed to hang on by her claws while Jennifer went humpity-bump over the tracks, one jump ahead of the engine's cowcatcher. Surely a scare like that should bring a man to his senses, sighed Josephine as she flopped down onto the car seat. However, the poor cat knew better. The foolhardy Mr. Frenzy kept a big foot jammed on the gas pedal as the old car raced on while Josephine worried. They were headed straight into a storm. Bellowing black clouds rolled over the countryside, and a streak of lightning shot through the sky, followed by a great rumble of thunder. The fierce wind sent tree limbs sailing past them and threatened to rip off old Jennifer's flimsy old top. Then the rain came roaring down, pounding the dusty road into slippery mud. And still, the frantic fellow sent the old car racing on at top speed. As night came on, Mr. Frenzy wheeled the old car into a service station at a crossroads. She was nearly out of gas. After the tank was filled and he had paid the attendant, Mr. Frenzy asked, "How's the road to Martinstown?" "Hilly as a camel's back and all mud," warned the old man. "If you try that road tonight, you're taking an awful chance." An awful chance was just the thing for Mr. Frenzy, and Josephine wasn't a bit surprised when they headed down the road to Martinstown through the driving rain. As the man had warned, the road was hilly as a camel's back and all mud. As Jennifer struggled up and down the hills, her churning wheels began to slip backwards, then sideways. Suddenly she skidded off the road, plunged over an embankment and into a ravine to end up nose down in a tangle of bush. Still, there was no stopping Mr. Frenzy. He pulled off his shoes and socks, rolled up his pant legs, jerked the suitcase off the seat, leapt up the embankment, and went sloshing away through the mud towards Martintown. Josephine was left crouched in a corner in the back seat, where she remained while the rain kept roaring down without a let-up. By morning, the stream that trickled down the ravine had become a raging torrent of muddy water. The powerful current swirled up to the car's front fenders and headlights, turning her half around. Josephine was desperate. If something wasn't done soon, her old car would be swept away. She scrambled out onto the top, looking wildly about for help, but there was not a soul in sight. The only sign of life was a red barn just over the hill beyond the trees. In one leap, Josephine took off across the woods straight for the barn. She hoped someone was there who could help. The miserably wet cat fought her way through the brambles and the bush, dodging past trees, bounding over logs, then slipping under a rail fence onto a barnyard. At first glance, the place seemed deserted. Then, as she approached the barn, she discovered someone. A small boy was in the barn shed feeding a swarm of fat farm cats, and Josephine quickly caught his attention with a loud, mournful meow. "Here, cat," he called, "come in out of the rain and have some breakfast." Josephine replied with another mournful meow and headed back for the woods. "Oh, I bet she's got a batch of kittens out there," thought the boy, and he left the other cats to go splashing across the barnyard. He vaulted over the rail fence and went stumbling along through the tangle of undergrowth with the scrawny stray cat leading the way. When finally they reached the old car, the boy peeked inside. "No kittens on the seats," he muttered, "and no kittens on the floor. If it's not kittens, it must be this old car you're worried about." Then he hurried away through the woods, leaving Josephine with one slim hope. She knew that most small boys loved old automobiles. Sure enough, the boy did love old automobiles, and to Josephine's joy, he returned with his father and a team of horses. They chained the team to the car's rear bumper, and after a bit of struggle, hauled her out of the ravine onto the road. Then, with the horses hitched to the front bumper, they headed back to the farm. "Can we keep it?" asked the boy, who was riding one of the horses. "It's not ours," said the father. "We'll store it in the barn shed until the owner shows up." The owner never did show up, and at last the farmer decided the old car was theirs. "She still runs pretty good," he said to his son, "so we might as well drive her into town now and then." The old fellow was a slow, careful driver, never going more than 20 miles an hour, which was just about Jennifer's favorite speed. And Josephine was always went along, either riding on the back seat or on the top. It didn't matter whether anyone knew it or not. The old touring car really belonged to the cat. The end.